Welcome to the AUA News Inside Track podcast, an official podcast of the American Urological Association. Thanks for listening. Today's episode is part of the SAU AUA Urology Match Insider series, developed by the Society of Academic Urologists in partnership with the American Urological Association. The SAU AUA Urology Match Insider series provides medical students interested in the field of urology an inside look into the Urology Residency Match process. The Urology Residency Match is owned and governed by the Society of Academic Urologists and administered by the American Urological Association. For more episodes of this podcast, please visit www.auanet.org/podcast.
So, hi everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our AUA podcast, Inside the Urology Match, What You Need to Know. And this is part of the AUA podcast series. I'm your host today. I'm Vivian Wang. I'm a current MS4 at the University of Pittsburgh. And today, this is part 2 of a series where we are trying to gear this episode towards upcoming applicants in the urology match this year and giving you all an overview of some of the topics that a lot of applicants are interested in. And with that, I'm really excited to bring back our 2 very special guests, Dr. Gina Badalato and Dr. Erica Traxel from the SAU, who are going to, again, lend their expertise and are very kind to join us again for part 2 of this podcast. So thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Badalato and Dr. Traxel. And if you guys could just briefly introduce yourselves as well for those who are just tuning in for this podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. It's great to be here chatting with you. And again, I'm Gina Badalato from Columbia in New York. I am a Vice Chair of Education and an Advisory Dean for the medical students at Columbia Medical School and also on the SAU board. And great to be here with my colleague, Dr. Traxel.
Thanks for having us. Yes, I'm Erica Traxel, and I'm an associate professor of urologic surgery at Washington University in St. Louis, where I was formerly the residency program director, also formerly a member of the SAU board, and still actively involved in the SAU Medical Student Interest and Resident Recruitment Committee. Really excited to be here. Thanks for the chance.
Great. And yeah, I think it's so. Again, very excited to have you both here. I think we're just going to dive right in, and hopefully, if for those that are listening to this, you listen to the first part of this podcast where we talked about timeline of the upcoming match. We talked about very comprehensively about like rank list submission deadlines, match day, integration with the NRMP timeline, as well as like some match policies, rules, and couples matching. So in this podcast today, we're going to be talking a little bit in the weeds about preference signaling, a little more in the weeds about secondary match and how that played out this past year, and then what applicants can kind of expect in terms of changes and evolving things in the match to come. So I'll just start by posing this question to you guys and kind of ask, in terms of preference signaling, can you guys give a brief overview of like the rationale behind preference signaling and how does it work and how can people kind of think about preference signaling?
I'm happy to jump on that one. So I'm proud to say that the SAU was actually an early adopter of preference signaling. We've now had it in place for 4 different match cycles, and the feedback that we have received from all stakeholders, both applicants as well as programs, has been extremely favorable. Our first 2 years, we had a small number of preference signals. Each applicant had 5 that they could allocate towards programs in which they were genuinely interested. The last 2 cycles, we expanded it to be a larger preference signaling system where each applicant can allocate up to 30 preference signals. No one is required to use the preference signaling system, but almost universally, all of the applicants do use their preference signals. And I think that's because it's been shown to be, you could say, relatively powerful. The whole original intent behind preference signals really was if you will, to try to address the bloat that had developed within the application process. There was a ever increasing number of applications that were being submitted, while there was a slight increase in the number of applicants to the urology match. Each individual applicant was applying to more and more programs. And essentially it had become an arms race, and, not faulting any of the applicants if they are trying to maximize their chances of successfully matching in a urology residency program. What tools do they have at their disposal? And so many of them were just applying to more and more programs. The consequence of that was the programs had hundreds and hundreds of applications to review in a very short timetable to identify applicants that they thought would be potentially successful residents in their programs. This was all happening within an era when we've been encouraging holistic application review, where we want programs to be really diving into these individual applications and trying to know who these applicants are. And it was just logistically not possible for the programs to review so many applications, as well as it was challenging for the applicants to be able to self-identify, hey, I'm not just applying to you because I'm trying to maximize my chances of matching. I'm applying to your program because genuinely I want to be at your program. And so a preference signal was a means by which both of these stakeholders could benefit. The applicant could genuinely indicate credible interest in a program. Hey, if I only have X number of signals and I'm choosing to send one your way, you can tell as a program, I am genuinely interested in you. And so what we have seen is there have been a trend in the last several years in the average number of applications that an applicant would submit. So 2 years ago, the average applicant was submitting 88 applications. A year ago, it was 67. And then this most recent match cycle, the average applicant submitted 49 applications. And perhaps this is due in part to preference signaling and, again, the power that it brings. What we have found is as we have gone to 30 preference signals per applicant, the vast majority of interview invitations that are extended are from programs to which an applicant sent a signal. It's not universal. So this last match cycle, the average applicant received 14 invitations to interview. And of those, about 12 and a half were from programs to which they had sent a signal. And 1.5 interviews were from a program to which they did not send a signal. And so I think that speaks to the power of the preference signal. And I think it's actually fulfilling kind of what the intent and the hope was that we would see from the preference signaling system. Dr. Badalato, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that is essentially what you said, that they're a way of leveling the playing field so that every applicant has a way to communicate with the program, regardless of whether they have a mentor or a connection at a particular place, where they can actually say, hey, I'm interested in you. Somebody described it to me today. We were explaining this to medical students, and it's kind of like sending a like, like on social media, like a like to something. It's
Swiping left.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's kind of function like an application cap, though, because in urology and orthopedics and some of the other surgical subs, there are relatively high number of signals. And so many programs may use the preference signals, as Dr. Traxel is saying, is to help consider who to give the interview to, because when you've got a very qualified pool of people, sometimes it comes down to like who really wants to be there. And so sometimes that can be a marker of saying, oh my gosh, this person really does want to be here. So I think those are all really important points, and the data that she presented supports some of the, supports that.
And I think probably applicants would be interested in knowing. It sounds like from the data, like most of the interview invites that people are getting from the past couple cycles are indeed places where they've signaled. But I guess how is it worth it for people to apply to more than 30? And how should people kind of be thinking about applying to schools or programs that they're not necessarily signaling or don't have the space to signal?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I do think there are other fields on the ERAS application that have been used in the past, including geographic preference signaling, where you can. So this is saying that I'm not sending you a program signal, but I can say, I like this geographic area, and this is the reason why. And sometimes people will write, my family is from here, I grew up here, I spent a large part of my life here. So that is to say that there are other ways to kind of indicate that you might be interested in a particular territory, and other specific reasons you could provide on the application. At least in my experience of being an advisor to students, the yield on the programs that they have not signaled in terms of interviews has been very low. And so I'm not, you can do that, but I just am not sure on the return of that energy and the money that comes with applying to more and more places.
Yeah, just to wrap some more metrics around that. So this last match cycle, when applicants were surveyed after submitting their rank lists, a survey goes out that's created by the SAU asking a lot of these important questions. And from that survey, we learned that 38% of applicants did not receive any interviews from any programs that they did not signal. So, that means that there are applicants who are getting some interview invitations from programs to which they applied, but did not send a preference signal. But certainly the vast majority of interview invitations are coming to applicants from programs to which they did extend a signal.
Great. And I think last kind of question I'll touch on for preference signaling is that I think applicants would be interested, and there have been students that would ask the question, is there a strategy that you might advise, or in general, kind of a strategy for preference signaling that you would recommend, both as advisors and people who have seen kind of the behind the scenes data on this kind of stuff?
I think, again, because the preference signal is so powerful, I think it is something to be very thoughtful about how you want to allocate those preference signals. I think the vast majority of applicants will use their preference signals, the majority of them, to programs to which, they're using all of them for programs to which they really want to go. And they are using many of them to programs that would be their, you could say, dream or ideal residency program. But I do think they are reserving some for programs that they might consider to be a quote unquote safety program. And so I think that it, again, is very helpful to talk to your local mentor or dean who is familiar with your application, and understanding what your ultimate goals are, and they can probably help to guide you as to how best to allocate your preference signals.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is completely from me and not from the SAU or any of that data. But as I talk with students about how to allocate the signals, it comes down to exactly what Dr. Traxel said, like where do you want to be? Think about this. And everybody has a priority going into the application process. Most of the students I work with, their main priority is geographic. They want to live and work in a particular area. And that tends to be what narrows the scope when I have my initial meetings with students. And then as they develop their rank list, you know, a lot of it is often centered around a certain geographic area with some interplay of other places that they were impressed with, but there's still this focus. So if they have that focus, I will have them. I think that there is some utility in kind of spreading the wealth and not necessarily giving your signals to, whatever rank list, like go down that route. Like there are great programs that really value the signal. I may not necessarily be ranked in the top 20, whatever programs, 30. Think critically about that, because those are meaningful, those are impactful, and maybe that'll fulfill your goal of being and living and working in a particular area, or working in a program that has some other goals that you're looking at for research, for clinical exposure, for a variety, for mentorship, or some other things. So I would say to be very critical, very thoughtful about what you're going to signal, because this is one of the more powerful influences that you can exert. This is really directly tied to interviews. So think out of the box, and just like you would want to interview at a range of places, think about giving your signal to a range of places, because that's ultimately what's going to constitute your match list, and you want some range and competitiveness on that also.
And one final addition, I think people can also utilize the preference signaling system in unique sets of circumstances. For instance, as we talked about in the first part of this podcast, if they have a partner who's also applying to the match in the same year, then they should work very closely with their partner to identify places that would be beneficial for both of them to be at. And so that might influence where they want to allocate their preference signals if they have a partner.
Those are all great points all around, and really appreciate that very kind of comprehensive look at what people should be thinking about when they preference signal. I kind of want to touch on another unrelated topic that we kind of touched on the first podcast, but kind of related to the secondary match and what applicants kind of should expect with the secondary match. We already talked about what it is and why it exists and the rationale, but can you guys provide any data on kind of how many spots were available this past year in the secondary match, and kind of what students were able to be like utilizing that secondary match, if any?
Yeah, so I can give a little bit more information surrounding that. And I think that, as you said, Vivian, the prior podcast kind of went through the rationale for this kind of early notification process, if you will, where people can learn a week before the actual match notification deadline whether they matched or not. So that gives them the opportunity to participate in a urology secondary match or enter the NRMP and register for the National Residency Matching Program. This was our first rollout this year of the secondary match, and I want to give credit to Matthew Sorensen from WashU, who really spearheaded a lot of this effort. So basically there were 5 sites with 6 positions. These were participating programs. They were all looking to increase their complement, so that they had filed to increase their number of residents for any given year. So they hadn't gone unmatched from that year, but they were expanding their residency. So normally they would have to wait another full year to participate in the match and fill those positions. But this allowed them to actually fill those vacancies, even though they didn't have match positions listed at the time that everybody else was kind of registering for the match this year. So it was a great opportunity. There were 126 unmatched applicants, and a majority of them, 109, participated in the secondary match. And then all of these 6 positions were filled through the secondary match. There will be more guidance, and the timeline will be kind of delineated very clearly on the SAU website, but it will be similar to what was in the prior year, where there will be like an earlier notification and about a week or so, where programs and applicants can organize themselves, apply through the secondary match, which would be through ERAS. So this is also an innovation because applicants used to have to kind of, I'm not going to say fax because that's going to date myself, but email their documents directly to the program. And all of this will be like, they can update they're given like a grace period where they can update their letters of recommendation or update their application. And then all of this is sent out through ERAS. So to really centralize that process. Did I miss anything, Dr. Traxel?
No, I think that's a really great summary of how it played out this year, and the feedback that we received from those programs who were looking to fill those open slots where they had increased their residency complement. They were grateful for the process. Admittedly, I think it was a little bit like drinking from the fire hose because they had lots of applicants, very qualified applicants to consider, and in a short period of time then figure out how they wanted to fill those open positions. But the feedback that we got from those programs was very favorable. I think aside from being able to fill any open positions, I think there is also a benefit to this early notification as to whether an applicant did or did not match, so that they can, to some extent prepare themselves psychologically. It's really hard when match day comes around and, your co-applicants who, maybe you're on a text thread because you all met each other doing the interview circuit and everyone's really excited. I matched at such and such. I matched at so-and-so. And you're still shell-shocked finding out perhaps you didn't match that day. So I think it provides some psychological buffer, and then it also gives people a little bit of an on-ramp to start figuring out what their next steps are going to be. So I think there's benefit to all parties with the secondary match.
Completely agree. And thank you guys for giving us some data and some insight into how it went this past year. I think we had a question about whether students can contact programs about unfilled positions, although I'm not sure how they would even know, but is there kind of a guidance about students who have not matched in the match, and kind of what should they just be like waiting for someone to contact them, or kind of what should they be doing in this process?
I think the secondary match process is in order to kind of like streamline that process for both the programs and the applicants. The applicants scrambling to see what's out there, and then the programs would be flooded with outreach from applicants, from their mentors or advisors, and it can become an exchange of a lot of overlapping and high volume information. So the intention of the secondary match is to kind of streamline that process so that the onus is not on the applicants to kind of search for all of that. I wonder if that person that question was also about vacancies. If somebody's doing a preliminary year, say in surgery, and thinking about vacancies that become available for like a PGY2 or PGY1 residency position, it's really, those vacancies would be posted on the AUA website. And I'm hoping to streamline, again, SAU to kind of also help disseminate that information in the future. But for now, it's all posted on the AUA website, and that's really where it's important to keep checking that, because there are vacancies that usually become available every year, and that diligence can pay off. And that process is less orchestrated and regulated and more dependent on your actively searching and looking and reaching out.
Great. And I think, we're kind of approaching the end of this really useful and very insightful podcast. I wanted to pose the question to you both as experts our experts from the SAU kind of, are there any changes that SAU is planning on making? Maybe not for this cycle and for applicants in upcoming cycles. Is there anything that people should be aware of? And how is SAU kind of evolving the process, if at all?
Oh, I was just going to say, there have been many innovations in the last handful of years. What with the universal interview invitation date, and then the next year we had heard feedback, and so we introduced flush date, preference signals, which evolved from 5 per applicant to 30 per applicant. The secondary match. All of these changes have transpired over like the last 5 years, and we actually did get feedback from constituents saying, can we just simmer for a bit? Because nobody wants to intentionally violate any of policies. And it can be, if it's this changing landscape, it can be a lot to keep up with. And so we heard that loud and clear, and the SAE said, okay, we're going to let it marinate for a little while and kind of see the changes that we have made, how everything kind of the homeostasis that we approach. I think the SAU wants to continue being on the forefront of innovations that will lead to even more equity in the process, both for programs as well as for applicants. And so as other concepts, questions, concerns arise in the future, then the SAU will absolutely consider those things. Again, kind of maintaining a North Star of equity in the process for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. I think that your voices are heard. So a lot of the changes that we talked about, secondary match, preference signaling, a lot of this was based on feedback from our constituents, from program leadership, on the poach match surveys, and the generations of people before you, Vivian, that participated in the match and completed a survey after they submitted their rank list or gave feedback as candidates. So your voice is powerful. Complete those surveys. We want to hear from you. I think in terms of changes on the horizon, the bigger change that happened this last cycle was reinstating the ability to do in-person interviews after a period of going fully hybrid. Virtual. So there were 3 potential scenarios where a program could offer all in person, all virtual, or a mix of both. And so I think that, as Dr. Traxel is mentioning, equity is really an important topic. And when we think about in-person interviews, there are costs associated with that: travel costs to the applicant, costs to the program. And I think that the SAU is going to look to provide a little bit more guidance on how to support applicants, but also being reasonable for programs in terms of not necessarily creating an arms race of offering more and more and more and more. So that there's some kind of baseline in terms of what the expectation is for costs associated with and covering costs for in-person interviews. So I think that would probably be the next frontier.
And you actually took the question out of my mouth, because I think that was also something that people were very curious about. And I know this is probably dependent program to program, but is there any guidance for this upcoming cycle about in-person versus virtual interviews?
Yeah, from what I understand right now, I think it's going to remain the same. That programs can choose whether they one of those 3, in person, hybrid, or virtual. But at least when the program directors were last surveyed, right after this match cycle, a lot of them were uncertain as to what platform that they may be offering. So just because a program offered virtual this last cycle doesn't necessarily mean they're going to offer virtual again. And so I don't foresee that changing. So I think that will probably be a similar, menu of options.
No, the SAU did require, so while they did leave it up to individual programs, what format they would utilize for their program for the interviews, they did very explicitly say at the time that the program extends the interview invitation to the applicant, they must notify the applicant of what that format will be. And that makes sense. You know, if an applicant is offered interviews on consecutive dates and they're on programs on opposite sides of the country, but maybe one of those interviews will be virtual, well, then that's very feasible for them to travel to one of those sites and then the next day conduct a virtual interview. It could be logistically much more challenging and expensive to fly across the country to get to 2 different in-person interviews. And so it's very important that the applicant have that information at the time that they are weighing all of their invitations to determine which ones they will accept.
Well, thank you both for really answering all of our questions and kind of providing a very honest and insightful look into the match process. I want to be respectful of both of your times today, and I just want to say thank you again so much for being here today, lending us some of your time. I know I learned a lot as someone who is applying this upcoming cycle, and I'm sure everyone out there greatly appreciates it. So thank you again.
This has been an AUA News Inside Track podcast. To hear more episodes of this podcast, visit www.auanet.org/podcast.